Jake Morrison's weathered hands froze mid-reach for his radio as Eleanor's desperate voice crackled through the static. Grid reference 47.6062 DG north. Mother bear dying. Cub won't survive the night. The coffee mug slipped from his other hand, shattering against the cabin floor. This wasn't another routine wildlife call. The coordinates led straight into Blackwood hunting territory, where federal agents had found 3 mutilated bear carcasses last month. His neighbor's dog began howling from across the valley, then another, until the entire mountainside echoed with an ancient warning that made Jake's prosthetic leg ache with phantom pain. Through his frosted window, he glimpsed helicopter searchlights cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like surgical blades. The framed photo of his son Tommy seemed to stare back at him from the mantel, the boy's final words still burning in Jake's memory. "Promise me you'll save the animals, Daddy." "All units, we have a code red in Sector 7, Jake barked into his radio, his Marine training overriding 18 months of grief-induced isolation. Who was this Eleanor, and why did her voice sound like she was already mourning the dead? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story.
Jake Morrison had learned to measure his life in losses. 3 Purple Hearts from Afghanistan meant nothing when you couldn't save your own family. The prosthetic leg clicking against the cabin's wooden floor reminded him daily of the roadside bomb that took his mobility but left him alive, a cruel joke when everyone he loved was dead. At 42, Jake carried the weight of a man twice his age. His weathered hands, scarred from shrapnel and calloused from gripping hospital bed rails during Emma's final months, now spent their days feeding stray animals that wandered onto his late father's property. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd survived 3 tours of duty only to become a part-time park ranger in Glacier National Park, hiding from human contact like some hermit. The cabin suffocated him with memories. Emma's coffee mug still sat in the kitchen sink unwashed for 18 months.
Tommy's bedroom remained exactly as the 8-year-old had left it before his final hospital stay. Action figures frozen mid-battle, a half-finished puzzle of grizzly bears scattered across the floor. Jake talked to their photographs every morning, updating them on weather conditions and animal sightings as if they might respond. Financial ruin stalked him like a predator. Medical bills from Tommy's leukemia treatment and Emma's lung cancer had devoured their savings, their insurance, and finally, their hope. The stack of overdue notices on his kitchen table grew thicker each week. Mortgage payments, hospital bills, utility companies threatening disconnection. $47,000 in debt with a part-time ranger's salary felt like trying to empty the ocean with a teaspoon. His sister Sarah called every Sunday, her voice tight with worry she tried to disguise as casual conversation. "Jake, honey, you can't keep isolating yourself up there. Tommy and Emma wouldn't want this for you." But Sarah lived in Denver with her own family, her own problems. She couldn't understand that grief had geological weight. It pressed down on him like the Montana mountains themselves. The morning routine had become sacred ritual. Coffee at dawn, reading Tommy's favorite nature magazine aloud, checking the perimeter for injured wildlife. Jake's military training made him methodical about patrols, but his damaged heart made him gentle with every creature he encountered. A one-legged deer had taken refuge near his woodshed. 3 orphaned raccoons denned under his porch. They seemed to recognize a fellow survivor. Winter in Montana demanded respect. Temperatures that could kill in minutes, snow that buried landmarks, isolation that drove strong men to madness. Jake's cabin sat 12 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by snowmobile or his modified pickup truck with tire chains. The solitude felt appropriate, punishment and sanctuary combined. His father's old ham radio provided the only regular human contact. Park Service frequencies brought reports of poaching activity, missing hikers, wildlife sightings. Jake responded to calls mechanically, professionally, but avoided face-to-face interactions whenever possible. He'd grown skilled at communicating through radio static rather than meeting eyes that might reflect pity. The eviction notice had arrived yesterday. 30 days to pay $12,000 or lose the only place that still held Emma and Tommy's presence. Some battles, Jake had learned, couldn't be won with courage alone. The emergency frequency crackled to life at 6:47 a.m., cutting through Jake's morning ritual of talking to Tommy's photograph. The voice belonged to an elderly woman, transmission weak but desperate. "Please, anyone monitoring? Grid reference 47.6062 dg north, 113.3971 dgs west. Mother bear dying. Cub trapped. They won't survive another hour." Jake's coffee mug hit the floor, ceramic exploding across worn wooden planks. Those coordinates placed the emergency deep in Blackwood territory, private hunting grounds where federal agents had discovered mutilated bear carcasses just last month. The area was supposed to be empty, off-limits to civilians. "This is Ranger Morrison responding," Jake transmitted back, already reaching for his emergency gear. "Ma'am, identify yourself and your situation." Static answered him. Then, faintly, "Eleanor. 12 years watching this family. Industrial trap. Please hurry." Jake's hands moved with military precision, stuffing medical supplies, rope, and bolt cutters into his backpack. The prosthetic leg made rapid movement challenging, but desperation fueled him. Something in Eleanor's voice, a grandmother's terror mixed with scientific precision, convinced him this wasn't a prank call. The snowmobile roared to life, spitting ice crystals as Jake navigated treacherous mountain paths. Wind chill drove the temperature below -25 degrees, turning exposed skin numb within minutes. 3 miles of brutal terrain separated him from the coordinates, each turn revealing fresh snowmobile tracks cutting through virgin powder. Eleanor's voice returned intermittently. "Hypothermia setting in. Massive blood loss. They used industrial steel. Oh God, the baby's barely breathing." The tracks led to a natural clearing where Jake discovered a scene from his worst nightmares. A massive grizzly bear, easily 350 pounds, lay trapped in a steel contraption that looked more like medieval torture device than hunting equipment. Her front paw was crushed between serrated jaws, bone visible through matted fur, crimson staining the white snow in an expanding circle. 6 feet away, a tiny cub, perhaps 6 months old, hung suspended in a wire snare, legs kicking weakly against the metal cable cutting into its neck. The trap's design was sophisticated, calculated to cause maximum suffering while keeping the animals alive for extended periods. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, dropping to his knees beside the cub. "You came." The voice belonged to a small woman emerging from the tree line, silver hair escaping from a woolen cap, green eyes sharp with intelligence despite her obvious age. She carried a veterinary kit that looked professional, expensive. "I'm Eleanor Whitfield. I've been monitoring this bear family for 12 years. Jake studied her weathered face, noting the easy confidence with which she approached the injured animals. "Ma'am, this is an active crime scene. We need to contact federal wildlife authorities." "That cub has maybe 90 minutes before hypothermia kills him," Eleanor replied, already preparing a syringe. "The mother's lost at least 2 pints of blood. You can follow protocol and watch them die, or you can help me save them." The moral calculus was brutally simple. By-the-book procedure meant calling for backup, waiting for specialized equipment, following proper chain of command. Standard response time for this location was 4 hours minimum. Neither animal would survive that long. Eleanor sedated the mother bear with practiced precision, her movements revealing decades of field experience. Bertha here lost 3 previous cubs to poachers. This little one's her miracle baby, born late in the season when most bears are already denning. Jake examined the industrial trap, recognizing the manufacturer's stamp, Blackwood Enterprises, Model X7. The same company logo appeared on hunting equipment advertisements throughout Montana, always featuring smiling families and conservation messaging. The contradiction felt obscene. "These traps are designed for extended suffering," Eleanor explained, working to stabilize the cub's breathing. "They keep animals alive but immobilized, sometimes for days. There's a market for live bears in certain international venues." The cub's eyes opened briefly, meeting Jake's gaze with an intelligence that reminded him painfully of Tommy during his final hospital days, aware, trusting, fighting against overwhelming odds. Jake's throat tightened as he remembered his son's last coherent words. "Promise me you'll help the animals, Daddy. They can't help themselves." Distant helicopter rotors began echoing through the valley, growing louder by the minute. Eleanor's face went pale. "He found us. After 5 years of hiding, Richard finally tracked me down." "Richard?" "My son." Eleanor's voice carried decades of regret. "The one who owns Blackwood Enterprises. The one who's been systematically destroying everything I've spent 40 years protecting." Jake's radio crackled with an unfamiliar voice. "This is Blackwood Security. We have federal hunting permits for this area. Any unauthorized personnel need to evacuate immediately." Eleanor gripped Jake's arm with surprising strength. "You have a choice to make, Ranger Morrison. Walk away and let them finish what they started, or help me prove that love is stronger than abandonment." The helicopter was close enough now to make conversation difficult. Jake looked down at the dying cub, then at Eleanor's desperate face, then at the Blackwood logo stamped into steel jaws designed for cruelty. Some decisions, he realized, defined who you really were. The black helicopter descended like a mechanical vulture, its rotors whipping snow into blinding spirals that stung Jake's exposed face. 3 men emerged from the aircraft with military precision. 2 armed security contractors flanking a tall figure in an expensive winter coat. Even at 50 yards, Jake could see the family resemblance between the newcomer and Eleanor. The same sharp green eyes, the same determined jawline, though where hers showed compassion, his radiated cold calculation. "Mother." Richard Blackwood's voice carried across the clearing with the bitter edge of 45 years of abandonment. "Still playing with your pets, I see." Eleanor stepped protectively in front of the injured bears, her small frame dwarfed by her son's imposing presence. "Hello, Richard. You've grown into a handsome man, just like your father." "Don't." Richard's hand cut through the air like a blade. "You lost the right to maternal observations when you chose animals over your own child." Jake positioned himself between the armed men and Eleanor, his military training automatically assessing threats and escape routes. The larger contractor, a man with neck tattoos and dead eyes, kept his rifle aimed casually at the ground, but his finger rested near the trigger guard. Professional. Dangerous. "Sir, these animals are protected under federal law," Jake said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "Any interference with a wildlife rescue operation is a felony." Richard's laugh held no warmth. "Laws are for people who can't afford lawyers, Ranger Morrison. Yes, I know who you are. 47,000 in medical debt, facing foreclosure in 30 days, son lost to leukemia, wife to cancer. Life's been unkind to you." The casual invasion of his privacy hit Jake like a physical blow. "How do you—" "Information is currency in my business." Richard pulled out a tablet, swiping through what appeared to be Jake's complete financial records. $12,000 would solve your immediate problems, enough to save your cabin, start fresh somewhere warmer. All you have to do is walk away. The offer hung in the frozen air like a poisonous fruit. $12,000, the exact amount needed to prevent foreclosure. Enough to keep Emma and Tommy's memory alive in the only place that still held their presence. Jake's prosthetic leg ached with phantom pain as he considered the implications. Eleanor's weathered hand touched his arm gently. "Your son would want you to choose love over money," she whispered. "I can see it in your eyes." He was the kind of boy who believed in heroes. "You don't know anything about my son," Jake snapped. But even as the words left his mouth, he knew they were false.
Tommy had spent his final months watching nature documentaries, making Jake promise to help animals who couldn't help themselves. The memory of those bright eyes, dimmed by chemotherapy but still burning with compassion, made Jake's decision inevitable. "Keep your blood money," Jake said, turning his back on Richard's offer. "Some things can't be bought." Richard's expression shifted from confident manipulation to genuine surprise, then hardened into something darker. "Marcus, show Mr. Morrison what happens to people who interfere with Blackwood operations." The larger contractor raised his rifle, but Eleanor stepped forward with shocking boldness. "Stop this, Richard, please. I know you're angry, but don't become the monster you think I am." "Monster?" Richard's voice rose to nearly a shout. "You want to know about monsters, Mother? Let me tell you about the 5-year-old boy who waited by the window every night for 3 years, believing his mommy would come home. Let me tell you about the teenager who built a business empire just to prove he was worth loving. You created the monster when you chose bears over babies." Tears tracked down Eleanor's weathered cheeks, but her voice remained steady. "I was 28 years old, terrified, and convinced I could have both career and motherhood. Your father threatened to kill himself if I took you away from him. I thought I'd have time to come back for you. 45 years of time, 45 years of cowardice." Eleanor reached into her coat, pulling out a worn manila envelope thick with papers. "I wrote you a letter every week. 783 letters I never had the courage to send. Everything I wanted to tell you, every milestone I missed, every night I cried myself to sleep wondering if you were happy." Richard stared at the envelope as if it might explode. "You expect me to believe—" "I don't expect anything," Eleanor interrupted. "I lost that right decades ago. But I'm asking you, as the mother who failed you, to let me save this family since I couldn't save ours." The injured mother bear stirred beneath the sedation, a low moan escaping her massive frame. The cub's breathing had become shallow, rapid, signs of advancing hypothermia that Jake recognized from his military medical training. Time was running out for arguments and revelations. "The cub's dying," Jake announced, kneeling beside the small body. "Whatever family drama you need to resolve, do it fast. This animal needs immediate medical attention." Richard looked down at the trapped bears, then at his mother's tear-stained face, then at Jake's defiant posture. For a moment, something almost human flickered in his cold green eyes. Then his jaw tightened and he signaled to his men. "Load them up," he commanded. "All of them. The bears, the ranger, and my dear mother. We're taking this family reunion somewhere more private." Eleanor's face went pale. "Richard, no. The cub won't survive transport. Please, I'm begging you." "You had 45 years to beg," Richard replied, his voice hollow. "Now it's my turn to choose who lives and who dies." Jake's hand moved instinctively toward his service weapon, but Marcus's rifle was already trained on him. The trap had been sprung, and they were all caught in its steel jaws now. The dying cub's eyes opened one more time, meeting Jake's gaze with what seemed like accusation. Another innocent he couldn't save, another promise to Tommy he would break. Unless he found a way to become the hero his son believed him to be. The helicopter's cargo bay felt like a flying tomb, its metal walls vibrating with engine noise that made conversation nearly impossible. Jake cradled the hypothermic cub against his chest, using his body heat as the only barrier between the small animal and death.
Eleanor sat across from him, her weathered hands working methodically to slow the mother bear's bleeding despite the aircraft's violent movements. Between them, Richard stared out the window with the hollow expression of a man who had won everything and gained nothing. Marcus, the lead contractor, kept his rifle trained on Jake while monitoring radio communications through his headset. His partner, Tony, piloted the aircraft with the casual competence of someone accustomed to transporting unwilling passengers. The destination remained unknown, but Jake's military experience suggested they were heading deeper into the Montana wilderness, away from federal oversight and potential witnesses. "Cub's pulse is weakening," Eleanor shouted over the engine noise, her veterinary training evident in how she checked the small animal's vital signs. "Core temperatures dropped below critical levels. We need to land soon or lose him." Richard finally turned from the window, his green eyes reflecting a complicated mixture of emotions. "The facility is 10 minutes out. It has everything needed for emergency veterinary care." "What facility?" Jake demanded, adjusting his grip on the cub as the helicopter banked sharply left. "My private research center," Richard replied with bitter irony. "Built with money earned from the very industry my mother despises. $12 million in state-of-the-art equipment, designed to study the animals she loves more than her own son." Eleanor's face showed genuine surprise. "You built a veterinary research facility?" "I built a monument to maternal rejection," Richard corrected. "Every piece of equipment purchased with blood money from hunting contracts, every laboratory designed to prove I could excel in your field without your guidance. The ultimate irony, using the profits from killing animals to perfect the science of saving them." The contradiction revealed layers of psychological complexity Jake hadn't anticipated. Richard wasn't simply a poacher motivated by greed, he was a damaged child acting out 45 years of abandonment through elaborate revenge fantasies. The realization made him more dangerous, not less. Through the cargo bay windows, Jake watched the landscape transform from familiar national park territory into private wilderness. Below, a massive compound emerged from the forest. Modern buildings connected by heated walkways, solar panels glinting on every roof, and what appeared to be large animal enclosures scattered throughout the property. The scale suggested serious money and long-term planning. "Jesus," Jake whispered. "How long have you been building this?" 15 years, Richard answered, "since the day I learned my mother's real identity. Did you know Eleanor Whitfield is considered one of the world's leading experts on ursine behavior? Her research papers have been cited in over 300 academic publications. I've read every single one, searching for some mention of the son she abandoned to pursue her brilliant career." Eleanor's hands never stopped working on the mother bear's wounds, but tears tracked down her cheeks. "Richard, I never intended—" "Save it for the letters you never sent," Richard interrupted. "We're here." The helicopter touched down on a concrete landing pad surrounded by motion sensor lights that activated automatically in the gathering dusk. Marcus and Tony moved with practiced efficiency, securing the aircraft while keeping weapons trained on their prisoners. The moment the rotors stopped spinning, Richard was out of his seat and barking orders into a radio. "Prep Operating Theater 3 for emergency surgery. Adult female grizzly, approximately 350 pounds, massive trauma to front left paw, significant blood loss. Also prep the pediatric warming station for a hypothermic cub, approximately 6 months old." The professional medical terminology surprised Jake almost as much as the facility's existence. Whatever Richard's psychological motivations, he had clearly invested serious resources in creating a world-class veterinary operation. 2 medical technicians appeared within minutes, wheeling gurneys and monitoring equipment. They worked with the calm efficiency of people accustomed to wildlife emergencies, transferring the mother bear with careful attention to her injuries. Eleanor insisted on accompanying the surgical team, her expertise overriding Richard's security concerns. Jake found himself alone with the cub in a specialized intensive care unit that rivaled anything he'd seen in human hospitals. Warming blankets, oxygen monitoring, intravenous lines. The small animal was surrounded by technology worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The irony felt surreal. An animal nearly killed by Blackwood traps being saved by Blackwood equipment. "Why?" Jake asked when Richard entered the room an hour later. "Why build all this if you're just going to destroy what your mother loves?" Richard settled into a chair beside the monitoring equipment, looking older than his 45 years. "You want to know the truth, Ranger Morrison? I built this place to impress her. Every piece of equipment purchased with the fantasy that someday she'd visit and see what her son had accomplished. The hunting contracts were just means to an end, generating revenue to fund the research she'd be proud of. But she never came. She never even knew I existed." Richard's laugh was hollow. "For 5 years I sent invitations to every conservation conference she attended. Birthday cards to her university address. Photos of the facility's construction progress. Nothing. Radio silence for 45 years. Then finally I realized the truth." Jake adjusted the cub's position, noting with relief that its breathing seemed steadier in the warm environment. "What truth?" "That I was competing with an impossible standard. You can't love someone back from the dead, and you can't force someone to choose you over their true passion. My mother didn't abandon me for another man or another family. She abandoned me for an ideal, the noble calling of wildlife conservation that I could never measure up to." The admission revealed depths of pain Jake recognized from his own struggles with loss. Richard's elaborate revenge scheme wasn't about hatred. It was about desperate need for acknowledgement from the one person whose approval he'd never received. "So you started capturing the animals she studied." "I started proving that her life's work was meaningless," Richard corrected. "Every bear I trapped was evidence that her conservation efforts had failed. Every animal removed from the wild was proof that nature couldn't survive without human intervention. My intervention." Through the observation window, Jake could see Eleanor working alongside the surgical team, her hands moving with the precise confidence of someone who had spent decades healing injured wildlife. Even at 73, facing her own estranged son's betrayal, she remained focused on saving lives. "She's not giving up on the mother bear," Jake observed. "She never gives up on anything," Richard replied with grudging admiration. "It's her greatest strength and her most devastating weakness. She'll fight for hours to save a dying animal, but couldn't fight for one day to keep her own son." The cub stirred in Jake's arms, its eyes opening to focus on his face with increasing alertness. The warming treatment was working. Core temperature had risen to nearly normal levels. Life returning from the edge of death, a miracle Jake had prayed for during Tommy's illness but never received. "This little guy's going to make it," Jake said softly. Richard stood and walked to the window overlooking the surgical suite. "My mother will be pleased." Another successful rescue to add to her impressive resume. What happens now? Now we wait to see if 45 years of resentment is stronger than 5 minutes of maternal instinct. Richard's reflection in the glass looked haunted. Marcus has orders to execute all witnesses if the mother bear doesn't survive surgery. If Eleanor can't save the animal she loves more than her own child, then perhaps she'll finally understand what abandonment feels like. The casual mention of execution sent ice through Jake's veins. "You're talking about murdering your own mother." "I'm talking about justice," Richard replied, but his voice lacked conviction. "She made her choice 45 years ago. Now she gets to live with the consequences." In the surgical suite below, Eleanor looked up through the observation window, her eyes meeting her son's gaze for a long moment. Even at this distance, Jake could see the love and regret in her weathered face. A mother looking at her child and seeing not the successful businessman or the dangerous antagonist, but the lost little boy she'd failed to protect. Richard turned away from the window, his jaw clenched with determination that couldn't quite hide the pain underneath. The surgery will take 4 hours. That gives us time to discuss your role in tonight's events, Ranger Morrison. My role? Whether you walk out of here as a witness to a successful wildlife rescue, Richard said, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip, or disappear into the Montana wilderness as another casualty of dangerous duty. The choice was brutally simple, but Jake had already made his decision the moment he chose to help Eleanor instead of taking Richard's money. Some lines, once crossed, changed everything about who you were. Outside, snow began falling again, covering the compound in a blanket of deceptive peace, while life and death decisions played out in sterile rooms filled with the most advanced medical equipment blood money could buy. The surgical suite's observation window became a theater of life and death as Eleanor worked with desperate precision to save the mother bear. Jake watched from the pediatric unit, the recovering cub nestled against his chest, both of them witnesses to a drama that would determine everyone's fate. Richard paced behind them like a caged predator, his emotional state growing more volatile with each passing hour. "She's losing too much blood," one of the surgical technicians announced through the intercom. "BP dropping to critical levels." Eleanor's voice crackled back, steady despite the crisis. "Increase the IV drip, prep 2 units of synthetic plasma, and get me better lighting on this arterial damage. She's not dying on my watch." The mother bear, Bertha, as Eleanor called her, lay unconscious on the surgical table, her massive frame dwarfed by the array of monitoring equipment. The industrial trap had caused catastrophic damage to her front paw, crushing bone and severing major blood vessels. 3 hours into surgery, Eleanor had managed to stop the primary bleeding, but secondary complications threatened to undo all her work. Richard's radio crackled with an incoming message. "Boss, we've got federal vehicles approaching the outer perimeter. Looks like Fish and Wildlife Service, maybe FBI backup. ETA 20 minutes. Jake felt a surge of hope. Someone had noticed their disappearance and tracked them to this remote facility. But Richard's expression darkened with dangerous calculation. "Lock down all access points," Richard commanded. "Activate perimeter security. No one gets in or out without my authorization." "Richard, please," Jake said, shifting the cub to maintain its warmth. "Federal agents are coming. This can end peacefully if you just—" "Peacefully?" Richard spun around, his eyes blazing with 45 years of accumulated rage. "Do you know what peaceful looked like for me, Ranger Morrison? It looked like a 5-year-old boy sitting by the window every Christmas morning, believing Santa might bring his mommy home. It looked like a teenager graduating valedictorian from high school with an empty seat in the audience where his mother should have been." The raw pain in Richard's voice cut through Jake's military composure. This wasn't just about wildlife trafficking or revenge. It was about a child's fundamental need for maternal love, twisted into something dark and destructive by decades of abandonment. "She's here now," Jake said gently. "Eleanor came when you needed her most. She's fighting to save what you both love." "What I love?" Richard laughed bitterly. "I don't love these animals, Morrison. I collect them. I study them. I use them to prove that maternal instinct is just biological programming, not genuine affection. Watch my mother work. She'll kill herself to save a bear she's known for 12 years, but she couldn't spare one phone call for the son she carried for 9 months. Through the observation window, Eleanor looked up from the surgical table, her face streaked with exhaustion and blood. Her eyes found Richard's, and for a moment the years seemed to dissolve. She pressed her hand against the glass in a gesture of desperate connection. Richard stepped closer to the window, his palm mirroring hers on the opposite side of the barrier. "She looks old," he whispered, vulnerability cracking through his armor of anger. "She looks like a mother who never stopped loving her son," Jake replied. The moment shattered as Marcus burst into the room, his weapon drawn and his face grim. "Boss, we've got problems. Those federal agents, they're not here for a rescue operation. They're serving warrants. Somebody tipped them off about the trafficking network." Richard's hand dropped from the window. "Oh, what are you talking about?" Tony intercepted their radio chatter. "They've got evidence of our shipping manifests, financial records, even GPS tracking data from the collars. Someone on the inside has been feeding information to federal investigators for months." Jake watched Richard's face cycle through confusion, betrayal, and finally a terrible understanding. "Eleanor," he breathed. Through the intercom, Eleanor's voice continued directing the surgical team with calm authority. "Suture holding well, pulse stabilizing, prepare post-operative antibiotics." But Jake noticed her occasional glances toward the observation window, monitoring her son's reaction to news she clearly anticipated. "You set me up," Richard said, his voice hollow with disbelief. "Your own son?" Eleanor's hands never stopped working, but her response came through the intercom speaker. "I've been working with federal wildlife investigators for 2 years, Richard. Every shipment you arranged, every facility you contracted with, every animal you captured, I documented it all." "Why?" The word torn from Richard's throat like a physical wound. "Because I couldn't save you from your father's abuse 45 years ago, but I could save you from becoming a monster today." Eleanor's voice carried decades of maternal anguish. "I thought if I could expose the trafficking network, if I could force you to see the consequences of your choices, maybe you'd remember the little boy who used to cry when roadkill hurt his feelings." Marcus raised his weapon toward the surgical suite. "Boss, she's been playing us this whole time. Let me end this." "No!" Richard's command stopped Marcus mid-motion. "She's still my mother." The cub in Jake's arms stirred, making soft vocalizations that sounded almost like questions. Its small body had warmed considerably, and its eyes tracked movement with increasing awareness. Life returning from the brink, a miracle that gave Jake hope for larger resurrections. "The mother bear stabilizing," one of the technicians announced. "Surgery successful. She's going to live." Eleanor slumped against the surgical table, exhaustion finally overwhelming her adrenaline. Through the intercom, her voice was barely audible. Thank God she made it." Richard stared at his mother's tired figure, emotions warring across his face. 45 years of planning revenge, only to discover that his target had been trying to save him all along. The federal agents outside represented justice, but also the end of everything he'd built to impress a woman who had been secretly working to destroy it. "Boss," Marcus pressed. "What are your orders? Those agents will breach the facility in 10 minutes. Jake seized the moment of uncertainty. "Richard, you can still choose differently." "Your mother didn't abandon you. She made an impossible choice and spent 45 years regretting it. Don't make the same mistake." "What would you know about impossible choices?" Richard snapped. "I know about watching someone you love die while being powerless to stop it," Jake replied, his voice steady despite the pain. "I know about survivor's guilt and rage at God, and the desperate need to blame someone for losses that make no sense. But I also know that revenge doesn't resurrect the dead or heal the wounds that matter most." The cub nuzzled against Jake's neck, its small body warm and trusting. A life saved against impossible odds, proving that love could triumph over cruelty when people chose to act with courage instead of fear. Eleanor's voice came through the intercom one final time. "Richard, honey, I know you're angry. I know I failed you as a mother. But please don't fail yourself as a man. The little boy I loved is still in there somewhere, and he wouldn't want this to end with more violence. Outside, the sounds of federal vehicles surrounded the compound. Spotlights swept across the windows, and authoritative voices called for surrender through electronic megaphones. The moment of decision had arrived. Richard looked at the cub in Jake's arms, then at his mother's exhausted figure in the surgical suite, then at Marcus waiting for orders that would determine everyone's fate. 45 years of anger balanced against 5 minutes of genuine maternal love, a lifetime of building walls weighed against one chance for redemption. "Sir," Marcus urged, "we need a decision now." Richard's hand moved toward his weapon, and Jake tensed, preparing to shield the cub with his body. But instead of drawing the pistol, Richard reached for his radio. The next words would determine whether this story ended in tragedy or transformation, whether a son could forgive a mother's failure, and whether love could prove stronger than abandonment when tested by the ultimate choice between vengeance and grace. Richard's finger hovered over the radio transmit button for an eternity measured in heartbeats. Through the observation window, Eleanor had collapsed into a chair beside the sedated mother bear, her 73-year-old body finally succumbing to exhaustion and stress. The successful surgery had drained whatever reserve she'd been running on, and Jake could see the gray pallor of someone whose heart was struggling under impossible strain. "Boss," Marcus pressed again, his weapon still trained toward the surgical suite. "Federal agents are at the main entrance. Whatever we're doing, we need to do it now." Richard's radio crackled with reports from his security team. "Perimeter breached at sectors 4 and 7. Thermal imaging shows at least 12 agents. They're cutting through the fence line." The cub in Jake's arms made a soft, whimpering sound as if sensing the tension that filled the air like an approaching thunderstorm. Its small eyes, now bright and alert thanks to the warming treatment, seemed to look directly at Richard with an innocence that cut through decades of carefully constructed hatred. "She looks like my grandmother did when she was dying," Richard said suddenly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Exhausted, used up, surrounded by machines, but fundamentally alone." Jake followed Richard's gaze to Eleanor, who had closed her eyes and was taking slow, deliberate breaths. Even from the observation room, it was clear she was in distress, one hand pressed against her chest, the other gripping the chair arm with white knuckles. "Richard," Jake said urgently, "your mother needs medical attention. That wasn't just exhaustion from surgery, she's having cardiac symptoms." Cardiac symptoms? For the first time since their confrontation began, genuine concern cracked Richard's cold facade. "What kind of symptoms?" "Chest pain, difficulty breathing, pale complexion." "Classic signs of heart attack or severe angina." Jake's military medical training kicked in automatically. "She needs immediate care, not interrogation by federal agents." Through the intercom, they could hear Eleanor's labored breathing, punctuated by soft moans of pain she was trying to suppress. The surgical technicians had noticed her condition and were moving toward her with monitoring equipment, but Eleanor waved them away weakly. "Focus on the bear," she gasped through the speaker system. "I'm fine, just tired." But she wasn't fine. Jake could see the telltale signs of cardiovascular distress, the way she favored her left arm, the sheen of perspiration despite the cool temperature, the increasingly rapid breathing that suggested her heart was struggling to pump effectively. Richard's radio buzzed with Marcus's voice. "Thermal scans show the old woman's in medical distress, heart rate elevated, body temperature dropping. Medics are saying possible cardiac event." The clinical terminology seemed to break through Richard's emotional defenses in a way that pleading hadn't accomplished. Suddenly, his mother wasn't the woman who had abandoned him. She was a 73-year-old cardiac patient who might die in the next few minutes. "Open the surgical suite," Richard commanded, his voice tight with panic. "Get our medical team to assess her condition immediately." "Sir, that's not advisable with federal agents." "I don't care about the goddamn federal agents!" Richard exploded. 45 years of suppressed emotion erupting like a dam burst. "That's my mother in there, and she's dying!" Marcus lowered his weapon, clearly shaken by his employer's sudden transformation. The cold, calculating businessman had disappeared, replaced by a terrified son watching his mother slip away just as he'd found her again. Jake seized the moment. "Richard, let the federal agents in. They'll have paramedics with advanced cardiac equipment. Your facility is amazing, but she needs a cardiac catheterization lab, not veterinary surgery tools." "The nearest hospital is 40 minutes by helicopter," Richard said, his hands shaking as he reached for his radio. "She doesn't have 40 minutes. Through the observation window, Eleanor suddenly doubled over in her chair, clutching her chest as a wave of pain visibly swept through her. The surgical technicians rushed to her side, but their equipment was designed for animals, not elderly humans experiencing massive coronary events. "Please," Eleanor's voice came through the intercom, barely audible now. "Richard, if you can hear me, I need to tell you something. Before—" The unfinished sentence hung in the air like a death sentence. Richard pressed his face against the observation window, his breath fogging the glass as he tried to get closer to the mother he'd spent 45 years hating and 5 minutes learning to love again. "Don't you dare die on me," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Not when I finally found you. Not when we finally have a chance to." But Eleanor's eyes had closed, and the cardiac monitor one of the technicians had managed to attach was showing dangerous irregularities. The woman who had spent her life saving animals was dying in a room designed for the creatures she loved more than her own survival. Richard's finger found the radio transmit button, and this time there was no hesitation. "All units, stand down. Open all access points immediately. Federal agents are cleared for entry. We have a medical emergency requiring immediate intervention." The decision made, Richard ran toward the surgical suite, leaving Jake holding the cub. A small life, saved just as another precious life hung in the balance. The surgical suite doors burst open as Richard crashed through, his expensive coat forgotten in his desperate need to reach his mother. Eleanor lay unconscious in the chair, her weathered face gray with the unmistakable pallor of cardiac distress. The makeshift heart monitor attached by veterinary technicians showed dangerous arrhythmias that made Richard's own chest tighten with panic. "Mom," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside her chair. For the first time in 45 years, the word felt natural on his lips. "Please don't leave me again." Federal agents poured through the facility's main entrance, their tactical gear and weapons creating stark contrast to the medical emergency unfolding in the surgical suite. Agent Sarah Chen, the lead investigator, assessed the situation with professional efficiency while paramedics rushed past her carrying advanced cardiac equipment. "Sir, step back, please," the lead paramedic instructed Richard as they positioned a gurney beside Eleanor's chair. "We need room to work." But Richard couldn't move. His hands hovered over Eleanor's still form, wanting desperately to touch her, but terrified that any contact might somehow make her condition worse. 45 years of imagined conversations, of rehearsed confrontations, of carefully planned revenge, all meaningless now as he watched the woman he'd both loved and hated slip away. "Vitals are critical," the paramedic announced. "Massive myocardial infarction, blood pressure dropping, pulse thready and irregular. We need to get her to a cardiac unit immediately." Jake entered the surgical suite carrying the recovering cub, which had grown noticeably stronger in the past hour. The small bear's eyes were bright and alert, tracking movement with the curiosity of a healthy young animal, life returning from near death, even as another life teetered on the edge. "Richard," Jake said gently, "let them work. She's in good hands now." "I should have called her," Richard said, his voice hollow with regret. 45 years, and I never once picked up a phone. I was so focused on making her pay for leaving that I never considered she might want to come back." Eleanor's eyes fluttered open briefly, unfocused but seeking. Her lips moved soundlessly, trying to form words that her failing heart couldn't support. Richard leaned closer, straining to hear any final message she might have for the son she'd lost so long ago. "Richard." The word was barely a breath, but it carried 45 years of love and regret. "The letters in my cabin. Every week I wrote. Told you everything. So proud of what you became." Her eyes closed again as the paramedics lifted her onto the gurney, medical equipment beeping urgently around her failing body. Richard followed them toward the helicopter that would transport her to the regional medical center, but Agent Chen intercepted him at the exit. "Mr. Blackwood, you're under arrest for violations of the Endangered Species Act, conspiracy to traffic protected wildlife, and operation of an illegal hunting enterprise." The handcuffs clicked around his wrists with metallic finality. "You have the right to remain silent." "Wait," Jake interrupted, stepping forward with the cub still in his arms. "Agent Chen, there's something you need to understand about this situation." Through the observation window of the departing helicopter, Richard could see Eleanor's unconscious form surrounded by paramedics working frantically to stabilize her condition. The distance between them grew larger by the second, measured not just in altitude but in lost time and wasted opportunities. "What is it, Ranger Morrison?" Agent Chen asked, though her attention remained focused on the handcuffed Richard. Jake took a deep breath, knowing his next words would fundamentally change how this story ended. "Eleanor Whitfield has been working as a federal informant for the past 2 years. Every piece of evidence you used to build your case came from intelligence she provided. She's been risking her life to expose this trafficking network." Agent Chen's expression shifted from professional suspicion to surprise. "Are you saying Mrs. Whitfield was our deep cover source?" "I'm saying she was a mother trying to save her son from becoming a monster," Jake replied. "Everything she did, the surveillance, the documentation, the evidence gathering, it was all an attempt to force Richard to confront what he'd become." Richard looked up from his handcuffs, confusion and hope warring in his green eyes. "She was trying to save me?" Jake nodded toward the manila envelope Eleanor had shown them earlier, now lying forgotten on the surgical suite floor. 783 letters she wrote but never sent. 45 years of documentation proving she never stopped thinking about you, never stopped loving you, never stopped hoping for reconciliation. Agent Chen retrieved the envelope, scanning its contents with growing understanding. Page after page of handwritten letters, each one dated and addressed to "My dearest son Richard." Birthday wishes for celebrations she'd missed. Proud observations about his business success gleaned from newspaper articles. Maternal advice offered to empty air. A lifetime of love poured onto paper because she'd been too afraid to deliver it in person. "Jesus," Agent Chen whispered. "She's been documenting his entire life." "More than that," Jake continued. "She built this case against him because she believed it was the only way to make him stop before he destroyed himself completely. The trafficking operation, the illegal hunting, the cruelty to animals, she knew it wasn't who he really was." Richard's voice cracked with emotion. "She spent 2 years gathering evidence to destroy everything I built? She spent 2 years gathering evidence to save everything you could become," Jake corrected. "Your mother didn't see a criminal, Richard. She saw a little boy who had lost his way and needed someone to guide him home." The weight of understanding settled over Richard like a physical burden. His elaborate revenge scheme, his methodical destruction of everything Eleanor valued, his careful orchestration of her final humiliation, all of it had been directed at a woman who was simultaneously working to protect him from the consequences of his own choices. "The facility," Richard said suddenly. "The veterinary equipment, the research laboratories, the animal rehabilitation programs, she knew about all of it?" Agent Chen consulted her tablet, scrolling through evidence files. According to our records, Mrs. Whitfield provided detailed intelligence about your facility's capabilities. She specifically noted its potential value for legitimate conservation work rather than trafficking operations. She saw what it could become, Jake realized. Not what it was being used for, but what it was capable of in the right hands. Through the radio, updates crackled about Eleanor's condition, stable but critical, en route to cardiac surgery, prognosis uncertain. The woman who had spent 45 years orchestrating the salvation of her son might not survive to see whether her sacrifice had been worthwhile. Richard looked down at the cub in Jake's arms, a small life saved by the combined efforts of three people who should have been enemies but had instead become an unlikely family, united by love stronger than abandonment, forgiveness more powerful than revenge. "Agent Chen," Richard said quietly, "I'd like to make a full confession and cooperate completely with your investigation. But first, I need to get to the hospital. My mother is dying, and I have 45 years of apologies to make while I still can." The handcuffs came off, replaced by the heavier weight of responsibility for redemption. The cardiac intensive care unit at Kalispell Regional Medical Center hummed with the quiet efficiency of machines keeping Eleanor Whitfield tethered to life. Richard sat in the bedside chair he'd occupied for 3 days straight, his expensive business attire replaced by rumpled clothes that smelled of hospital coffee and sleepless nights. The manila envelope containing 45 years of unsent letters lay open on his lap. Pages spread like fallen leaves around the story of a mother's unspoken love. Jake stood by the window, the recovering bear cub nestled in a specialized carrier that the hospital had allowed as part of Eleanor's treatment. The small animal had refused to eat unless Jake was present, creating an unlikely therapeutic bond that even the medical staff found remarkable. Outside, Christmas Eve snow blanketed the parking lot in pristine white that reflected the soft glow of holiday lights strung around the hospital entrance. "December 24th, 1978, Richard read aloud from one of Eleanor's letters, his voice hoarse from days of speaking to an unconscious woman. "My dearest Richard, today you turned 3. I bought a birthday cake and put 3 candles on it, but I had no one to help you blow them out. I saved you a piece anyway. Wrapped it in foil in case you might somehow taste it on the wind." Eleanor's eyes remained closed, but the heart monitor showed slight fluctuations that the nurses said might indicate awareness. Dr. Patricia Williams, the cardiologist overseeing Eleanor's care, had cautiously suggested that familiar voices could aid in recovery from the massive heart attack that had nearly claimed her life. "This is good," Dr. Williams said, checking Eleanor's chart during her evening rounds. "Her brain activity increased significantly when you started reading the letters. Keep talking to her." Agent Chen entered the room carrying 2 cups of coffee and an update from the ongoing investigation. Over the past 72 hours, Richard's complete cooperation had led to the dismantling of an international wildlife trafficking network that spanned 3 countries and involved over $40 million in illegal transactions. "The judge approved the plea agreement," Agent Chen announced quietly. 2 years suspended sentence, 5 years probation, full restitution, and transformation of your facility into a legitimate conservation center operated in partnership with the Fish and Wildlife Service. Richard nodded without looking up from the letters. Legal consequences seemed irrelevant compared to the possibility that his mother might die without ever knowing he'd finally understood her sacrifice. "What about the animals we recovered?" 47 bears relocated to sanctuaries, 12 successfully returned to the wild, 3 requiring long-term medical care at your facility. Agent Chen's voice carried grudging respect for the scope of Richard's cooperation. "Your intelligence helped us identify trafficking routes we'd been investigating for 6 years. Jake adjusted the cub's position in its carrier, noting how the small animal's eyes tracked Eleanor's still form on the hospital bed. He keeps looking at her like he's waiting for something. Animals sense things we don't, Dr. Williams observed. Sometimes they know when someone's fighting to come back. The cub made a soft vocalization, almost like a question, and Eleanor's fingers twitched slightly in response. Richard dropped the letters, leaning forward to take his mother's hand for the first time since childhood. "Mom," he whispered. "Can you hear me?" Eleanor's eyelids fluttered, and her lips moved soundlessly before her eyes finally opened, unfocused but seeking. "Richard?" The word was barely audible, but it carried the weight of 45 years of separation. "I'm here," Richard said, tears streaming down his face. "I read all your letters, every single one. I understand now." Eleanor's hand tightened weakly around his fingers. "The animals, did they?" "They're all safe," Jake assured her from the window. "The mother bear survived surgery and is recovering. The cub is here with us, getting stronger every day." A smile ghosted across Eleanor's pale lips as her eyes found the carrier, where the cub watched her with bright intelligence. "He's beautiful, just like his mother." "Mom," Richard said urgently, needing to voice 45 years of regret while she was conscious to hear it. "I'm sorry. For everything. For the hunting. For the trafficking. For hating you instead of trying to understand. I wasted so much time on anger when I should have been looking for you." Eleanor's voice was weak but clear. "You were protecting yourself. I abandoned you when you needed me most. The anger was justified." "No," Richard insisted. "I read about Dad's threats, about the ultimatum he gave you. You were 28 years old, terrified, trying to do what was best for everyone. I built my hatred on lies he told me about your choice." Memories flooded back to Eleanor, and her eyes filled with tears. "Your father said he'd kill himself if I took you away. He said you'd be better off thinking I was dead than knowing I chose my career over my family. I was young, naive. I thought I could have both." "You could have," Richard said gently. "You should have. I'm sorry he made you choose." Agent Chen cleared her throat softly. "Mrs. Whitfield, I need to ask about your work as an informant. The intelligence you provided led to the largest wildlife trafficking bust in federal history. Why did you risk so much?" Eleanor's eyes found Richard's face, studying the man her little boy had become. "Because I recognized the symptoms, the emotional distance, the need to control nature instead of protecting it, the transformation of love into possessiveness. Your father showed the same signs before he became violent. You were trying to save me from becoming him," Richard realized. "I was trying to prove that love could be stronger than abandonment, that a mother's protection could survive decades of separation." Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Every piece of evidence I gathered, every trafficking route I documented, every animal I helped rescue, it was all practice for saving the most important creature of all." Jake stepped closer to the bed, the cub making soft sounds of recognition as it detected Eleanor's familiar scent. "The facility Richard built, the equipment, the laboratories, the rehabilitation programs, you guided him toward conservation even when he thought he was choosing destruction." Eleanor nodded weakly. "I couldn't contact him directly, but I could influence the scientific community, recommend equipment suppliers, suggest research directions through academic channels. Every legitimate conservation organization he worked with had received my input." "You've been protecting me my entire adult life," Richard said with wonder, "even when I was actively working against everything you believed in." "Especially then," Eleanor corrected. "That's what mothers do. We protect our children from themselves when they can't see clearly." Dr. Williams checked Eleanor's monitors, her expression cautiously optimistic. "Heart rhythm is stabilizing, blood pressure improving. Mrs. Whitfield, you're going to need extensive cardiac rehabilitation, but I think you're going to make a full recovery." The cub suddenly stood in its carrier, making insistent vocalizations toward Eleanor's bed. Jake lifted the small animal carefully, allowing it to see Eleanor more clearly. The bear cub extended one tiny paw toward her, and Eleanor managed to touch it with her fingertip. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "You're going to grow up safe and free, just like your mother wanted." "What happens now?" Richard asked, his voice still shaky with the enormity of this reunion. "I have 2 years to transform the facility, but after that—" Eleanor's eyes brightened with maternal pride she'd never been able to express. "After that, you continue the work we started together, the Eleanor Whitfield Conservation Center, if you'll allow me to put my name on your achievement." "Our achievement," Richard corrected. "I couldn't have built it without the foundation you gave me, even when I didn't know you were giving it." Jake looked out the window at the snow-covered landscape, thinking about Tommy and Emma and the promise he'd made to help animals who couldn't help themselves. "I'd like to request a transfer to work at the Conservation Center, if you'll have me." "We'll need a head ranger," Richard said immediately. "Someone who understands that protecting wildlife means protecting the bonds between all living things." Agent Chen smiled, gathering her paperwork. "Mrs. Whitfield, when you're recovered, the Fish and Wildlife Service would like to offer you a consulting position. Your expertise in undercover conservation work could be invaluable." Eleanor's laugh was weak but genuine. "At 73, I think I've earned a quieter role. Maybe just grandmother to whatever orphaned animals need a family." The cub chirped softly, as if volunteering for adoption, and Eleanor's heart monitor showed the steady rhythm of someone finally at peace. Outside, Christmas Eve bells began ringing from the hospital chapel, marking the birth of hope in a world that had seemed beyond redemption just 3 days earlier. Richard lifted one of the unread letters from the scattered pile. "Would you like me to keep reading these to you?" "No," Eleanor said, squeezing his hand with growing strength. "I'd rather hear about your life from you. We have 45 years of conversation to catch up on." As snow continued falling outside and the cub dozed peacefully in Jake's arms, 3 people who had been broken by loss began the slow work of healing. A mother who had chosen sacrifice over selfishness. A son who had chosen forgiveness over revenge. A ranger who had chosen purpose over grief. The mother bear had recovered enough to be released back into the wild, where she would teach her cub the skills needed for survival. But this human family was just beginning to learn the most important lesson of all, that love multiplies when shared, that time lost can sometimes be redeemed, and that the bonds between parents and children can survive any distance when anchored by genuine care. In the cardiac unit of a Montana hospital, on the night before Christmas, 3 broken hearts learned to beat in rhythm again, proving that the greatest conservation work wasn't always about saving animals. Sometimes it was about saving each other. Dear friends, if you're listening to this story and feeling that familiar ache in your chest, you're not alone. As someone who understands the weight of regret, the pain of words left unsaid, and the fear that it might be too late to heal old wounds, I want you to know that Eleanor and Richard's story isn't just fiction, it's hope wrapped in truth. How many of us carry letters we never sent, phone calls we never made, forgiveness we never offered? At 55, 60, or 68, we sometimes feel like our chapters are already written, our relationships set in stone. But Eleanor proved that love can survive 45 years of silence, that a mother's heart never stops fighting for her child, and that redemption doesn't have an expiration date. Maybe you have a Richard in your life, a child, sibling, or old friend separated by pride or misunderstanding. Maybe you are the Richard, carrying decades of hurt that's hardened into armor. This Christmas season, remember that the most powerful conservation work we can do is saving the relationships that matter most. It's never too late to choose love over being right, connection over protection, healing over hurt. What relationship in your life could benefit from the kind of courage Eleanor showed? Have you ever experienced a moment when forgiveness transformed everything? And how did it change you? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.